It is amazing how many people I have come in contact with lately that are struggling with codependent behaviors and patterns. So, what I decided to do for this week's episode is to repurpose an episode that I did a while back with Alana Carvalho, who specializes in codependency. Her podcast is called The Codependent Perfectionist. We talk about what is codependency and what do these patterns look like. It was a phenomenal conversation and well received by all of you. Because I'm leaning toward doing more solo episodes on codependent behaviors, I thought it would be a great idea to share this one again to prime the pump and get you thinking about what is codependency and do you see yourself in this conversation? Do you see yourself having codependent patterns and are you ready to unhook from them? I hope you enjoy this episode.
I just had the most amazing conversation with spiritual coach, author, podcast host, Alana Carvalho. She coined the term the codependent perfectionist. It's the name of her podcast. And you can find her on Instagram, the codependent perfectionist. What I loved about this conversation is we covered so much territory. We talked about what is codependency, what is the codependent perfectionist? What does perfectionism look like? What does it look like if you are enmeshed? What is if you feel like you have some codependency tendencies, perfectionistic tendencies, your relationships aren't the most healthy, or you suspect that your relationships aren't fulfilling, then I encourage you to tune into this week's episode. Welcome to the Masks Off for People Pleasers and Perfectionists podcast. I am Kim Gross, your host, and it is my mission to help you unmask from people pleasing and perfectionistic behaviors so that you can finally have the confidence to live the life that you truly desire. Let's tune in to this week's episode. Alana, as a spiritually attuned counselor, an author, and podcast host of is it the Codependent Perfectionist?
Yep.
Yes. You talk about this term, the codependent perfectionist.
Mhm.
I'm a recovering codependent. I'm a recovering perfectionist, but I never heard the two terms mixed together.
Okay.
I would love for you to share with the listeners, how did that even come about? And can you differentiate between codependency and perfectionism, what each of those mean to you?
You mentioned before that I'm spiritually attuned. Spirituality has been a really important part of my journey, my recovery. When I was in my initial therapy, I learned that I was codependent. I also learned that I was a perfectionist. One day, a couple years ago, when I was thinking about writing my book and all of these things I wanted to speak about, I intuited the codependent perfectionist. Like it came and just hit me. I
Love
was
it.
on a subway and I was like, oh my God, that's what this is all about. The things that I wanted to speak about. And for me, they're just so intertwined. Codependency, in what I teach people, that a basic way of understanding codependency, because it's such a vast topic, right, is the idea of caring too much. And so that's like the most basic form of understanding codependency. And perfectionism is a similar thing. In both codependency and perfectionism, we're basing our self worth, our identity on external factors. In both codependency and perfectionism, we're holding ourselves to really high, unrealistic standards for ourselves. And so they tend to really go hand in hand. Sometimes I even like to say that codependency can be thought of as relational perfectionism in a sense, right? Because us holding ourselves to these really high standards in the way that we relate to the people around us in our lives, right? So again, that's one aspect of it, but it encompasses a lot of things.
Yeah, it totally does. I've been a recovering codependent for decades. I used to go to codependent anonymous meetings and read from the 12 steps and understand it and embody what codependency is. And I've read every one of Melody Beatty's books. I still can't describe it or
I
define
know.
it. It is such a vague umbrella term. I applaud you for attempting to and doing a great job of defining codependency. So maybe we can dig a little deeper. What would you say if someone was listening to this episode and they're trying to decide for themselves? It's a lot easier to define if they're a perfectionist, right?
Sure.
Even though on my website, I have a quiz for perfectionism as well. Even though people say, I'm not a perfectionist, you freaking are. You don't know.
Right.
There's so many nuances.
Absolutely. People tend to think, just to stay on the perfectionism piece for a second, that if you're a perfectionist, that means you behave in these perfect kind of ways. One of my clients would always be like, Alana, you don't understand. My home is a mess. I'm not a perfectionist. And I was like, that's not what it's always about. That's one aspect of things, but that's not what perfectionism is on the whole.
Okay, so let's divert for a second.
Yeah.
Since we were just talking about it, let's go into that a little bit more, the nuances of perfectionism, and then we'll loop back into describing some of the hallmark signs or traits of the codependent.
Sure.
So let's talk about that perfectionism because you're right. It is not just about, oh, my hair has to be a particular way, my outfit has to look so, my closet has to be color coordinated, which by the way, mine was when I was a teenager.
Mine
But
and mine still is.
it's not
Just because we're in recovery doesn't mean we get rid of all of our quirks, right?
Thank you for saying that and making it so relatable. So true. My closet's pretty meticulous, but nonetheless, yep, there are people who their homes may be a complete mess, their car's trash, but yet they still have these perfectionistic tendencies. Can you
Right.
describe or speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. It's really, to me, it's more about holding ourselves to unrealistic standards. It could happen in certain areas of our life. For example, for myself, I talk about in my book that there was this moment where I was sitting in graduate school. It hit me because I tend to have these moments. And I realized that school wasn't about my grade. I guess I was about maybe 23, 24 at the time that this happened. I'd been in school my whole life. It never occurred to me that school was about learning, even though that's a clearly obvious thing. But for me, it was about how many A's can I get? How good can I do so that because in perfectionism, we're really deriving our sense of self, our sense of self esteem from external events, right? So it's from the title of our position, it's from the next time we get a raise, it's from the grades we get in school. It's all of these things, like how much I accomplished today, right? It can be all of these very external things. And so, in both codependency and perfectionism, we tend to have truly low self esteem on the inside and not a good sense of self. So, our bar is always too high. For me, I put incredible amounts of stress on myself to do well in school because that was a strong part of my identity throughout my childhood, my teen years, into my early 20s. And when that occurred to me that it actually wasn't about my grades, was the first time I started enjoying school. And it was such a shame. I actually felt really sad in that moment because I realized I had missed out on this opportunity to learn all of this time, right? To enjoy the experience of learning. Because it was never about that for me.
Yeah, I love that you shared that because my story is very similar in terms of the grades and the external validation. For me, the defining moment happened when I was 10. Before the age of 10, I knew what it felt like to be my true self. When I was in nature, when I was playing in the snow and making a snow angel or riding my bike down the street, I felt my true self, connected to myself. But then when I was 10, my teacher said to my parents at a teacher conference, Kim's such a pleasure to have in class. She's such a good girl. She
Mhm.
doesn't disrupt. However, she's not working to her potential.
Mm.
When I learned that, it was like, oh, okay, now because I was also a people pleaser, let me please my teacher.
Right.
And I started getting those really good grades. That external validation felt so good that I craved more and more of it because I was learning that just being Kim and being wasn't enough. I had to perform, I had to perfect.
Right.
And I started at the age of 10.
Right.
It was a
You
drug.
get hit.
It was
Yeah.
an endorphin hit. It was like ding, ding, ding. Oh, that feels good. And then my aunt would give me $5 for every A, and my parents saw me. Oh,
Right.
Kim, growing up in a dysfunctional home, my role was to be the star
Right.
child. Everybody lived through me. All of this was unbeknownst to me. I didn't know that this was happening, but it was a pattern that played out for a long time. I often like to say, and I wonder what your thoughts are as far as the perfectionism, that for so long, and sometimes it can still creep in, there's this feeling of I have to have the pedal to the metal
Mhm.
24/7, internal pressure to just go, be a human doing, not a human being. And in order to just rest and be in my skin and
Yeah.
doing nothing can feel so freaking uncomfortable sometimes. And I have to be
Absolutely.
very mindful. Any thoughts on that?
One of the things, it's so funny because as a therapist, many people come into my office and they're like, I need to figure out why I'm so lazy, like why I can't get more accomplished. And it's all of these things. And I'm just like, no, it's the opposite. You're actually doing enough. You're holding yourself to standards that are beyond realistic, right? So one of my clients actually brought in this story to me, and I often share it with other people because I think it's so great. But he himself was a perfectionist, and he went to see this speaker who's this highly successful person, and he was like, "Oh, I can't wait to learn like all of these like success tips of how I can get more accomplished and all this stuff," right? And he said the speaker starts and he's, "I guess you all want to know what my key to success is." And everyone's listening and he says, "I'll tell you. I set my bar so low each day that I just jump right over it." And I'm like, wow, it's not that we all should just not be motivated and not do much. In my perfectionism recovery, even though people don't believe it, I actually get way more done. It feels great. People think that if you let go of these high standards that suddenly you'll stop doing things. And that's not what happens. If we lower the bar for ourselves, we take down the pressure, right? We take down the stress around it. And so what happens instead is that we just feel better about ourselves and then we can do more. It all starts to feel very different because it's not about deriving our sense of self esteem from what we're doing, right? It's about, I'm doing this because I have the energy for it, or it feels really good, or this is what I want to do today, or whatever. It's not, I have to check off all of these things because if I don't, that means I'm a lazy person, or that means I'm not accomplished enough, or whatever the thing is we have for ourselves. So I really like to help people work on that. And I find that we become more motivated when we can push ourselves with our limiting beliefs around these things.
100%, because part of what I think you are describing there is that when we are putting so much internal pressure on ourselves and cutting off from our true self, we're not tapping into our bodies, we're not tapping into our spirits. There's this external push to go. And so when we do that, we're abandoning our true selves. So when we abandon our true selves, there's this sense of, I think we actually end up procrastinating because we feel like we can't keep achieving this high expectation that you mentioned, and we're abandoning ourselves. So we feel like shit on the
Mhm.
inside. And then it's a domino effect. I'm pushing too hard. And none of this is probably on a conscious level, all
Right.
subconscious.
Right.
So I just, you know what? I'm not going to do it. And you go into all or nothing, right? The perfection
Yep.
goes into all or nothing.
Yes.
But I firmly believe that no matter what, at the end of the day, I could never go to doing nothing.
Mhm.
There's a part of me that would just never allow myself to be like, I used to be afraid that I
Mhm.
would be that lazy person that sat on the couch and ate bonbons all day
Right.
long.
Right.
That will never happen. But what you're saying is so beautiful, that when you come from a place of inner self worth,
Mhm.
inner abundance, and you come from that energy
Mhm.
and you're flowing more, you do get more done. You do accomplish and you have actually more energy.
Yes, absolutely. It
Yeah.
feels so different, right? The whole experience is like, we don't, because I find that with my perfectionist and with myself, unfortunately, we tend to always look at the negative, what I didn't do, what I could have done better. And when we really start working on that, we shift so that it's not always those negative thoughts. It's like, how much did I do? Wow, I did a lot, or I did enough, or today was a nice day off. It's not all this negative thinking about everything and picking ourselves apart at any moment.
I love that. Okay, so that definitely paints a really good picture for our perfectionists out there who are saying, I'm not a
Right.
perfectionist.
Yeah.
Like, you tap into anything that Alana and I just said,
Mhm.
you might be. Okay,
Yes.
so let's go back to the codependence again, because I feel like it's hard sometimes to understand what codependency means. And for someone listening to tap in to identify whether or not they
Mm.
can resonate. So, what could you say more about the codependency part?
Sure. So I think we had mentioned before codependency, it's such a vast thing and it can be so nuanced, right? It is very difficult to pinpoint any one thing. For myself, how I found out about it was I was sharing a story thing with my therapist. It had to do with putting another person's needs before myself, not really considering what I wanted or what I was thinking about it. It was more like, what do they want? How can I make it work for them? You mentioned the term self abandoning. It was a repeated pattern of that, right? And then one time I looked at her and I said, why am I doing that? And she was like, because you're codependent. I started to realize how it was showing up in my life in all of these different ways where I was saying yes to things when I didn't really feel like it was right for me. With codependency, we don't even stop to consider, am I okay with what I just said? Does that even work for me? We just react to things very quickly. We see someone in distress, we want to take it away. We have a really hard time being in uncomfortable feelings and allowing other people to also be in uncomfortable feelings, right? So it could be something as small as my husband coming home from work and him having a bad day. And suddenly now I'm having a bad day because he had a bad day, right? And then we're all in it. That's the piece we talked briefly before we got on about enmeshment, where we have a hard time as codependents seeing where I end and someone else begins. So oftentimes, if someone else is going through something difficult, we are automatically going through something difficult as well. Recently, I was working with a husband and wife where every time the wife was having a difficult experience, the husband was getting too involved in it with her. She was upset. Then he was upset, right? He was trying to make her not upset because it was making him upset. She was upset, right? So this is the
I
pattern.
get it.
Yeah. So then he was like doing things to try to fix it or make comments to take it away. But there was no easy solution to what she was going through, which is common in life. So she starts getting frustrated. He starts feeling burnt out and frustrated that he's trying to fix this thing he can't fix. And she feels like, I just need to move through this, and you're not really letting me do that. So there's a disconnect that's happening. He's been working on allowing her to have feelings, knowing when it's too much for him to like, because he can't be her therapist, right? So as codependents, we tend to overdo it and over be there for someone else and not know, okay, now it's been 7 days in a row that we've been talking about a difficult situation. Maybe I need a break from it, right? And knowing where to allow ourselves to step back and not be there for other people 24/7. It's too much for anybody.
Okay, I love that you brought that example up. I'm going to bring up a personal example. My kids are 25 and 22, and I have been working on changing and healing my pattern with them for a really long time. But it is still so freaking hard to really know when to draw the line and
Oh,
when to
yeah.
draw the boundaries. Let's say, for example, that my daughter's going through something with a boyfriend and she's having a hard time. She's having a struggle.
Mhm.
And as a mom, I think it's even harder because naturally we want to swoop in,
Oh, yeah.
rescue, save, and fix, which are also masks that I've
Yeah.
worn in the past, all of them.
Mm. Mhm.
But on the other hand, I think because my perfectionism then comes in, I don't wanna go from all or nothing and become like a cold-hearted
Right.
bitch,
Yeah.
right? So, using that kind of hypothetical scenario, what would it look like or sound like from me to my daughter that would be a healthy way of communicating as opposed to being enmeshed with her.
Sure. I love working with adult children and adult parents because it's such a beautiful thing. Because what's meant to happen is there's a transition of that relationship, right? From a child parent relationship to an adult child parent. And it's very different, right? But
Very.
one of the things that I think is so important in all parenting is first what you're saying to yourself, right? So the first thing is I need to know that it's actually good, helpful, important for my child to go through difficulties. If I have it in my head that they shouldn't experience pain, then my go to is that every time they're going through something difficult, my internal dialogue is I need to prevent them from feeling this way, or I need to take this away from them. Whereas I believe that it's actually a really important part of their spiritual journey in this lifetime for them to go through these different struggles. As a parent myself, believing that and actually like putting that into practice is very challenging,
Thank
right?
you.
Because just 'cause I know that to be true, like I firmly believe that doesn't make it easy. It's actually very challenging because I have to repeatedly tell myself that, particularly for those of you listening who have highly emotional, strong willed children. I have at least one of those myself. It becomes even more challenging because distress tolerance is low. It
Mhm.
makes you feel like you need to come in and reduce the distress for them. But actually, those types of children, and really all people, need to build up their own ability to sit with distress, right? Codependent parents tend to take that away from our children, which is not good for them because they become dependent on us to solve their struggles. It's not our job to solve our struggles, right? So, in your situation with your older child, it's really wonderful for you to do this. This is important for teens and even young children. I do this with my younger daughters too. You want to ask them, how can I support you with this? How can I help you with this? Do you want feedback? Do you want advice? Do you want me to just sit and listen? The minute we allow them to think about what is it that I want here, then they are in charge of it. What we parents tend to do is come in with, hold on, I have a solution to your problem. Let me tell you. But we really want it to be on them. Once they say to us, I'd really love to hear what you think, by all means, go for it.
I have been learning about conscious parenting from Dr. Shafali. I've taken
Mhm.
all her courses, read all her books,
I love her.
and I love her. So I have been practicing this since they were 10 and 13. I
Right.
am at a point now with my kids that I can have that kind of conversation, and I will. I love that you said that. I'm doing it right.
Right.
I'll
Yep.
get validation from Alana.
Sure.
But I do say to her when she's distressed about something, how can I best support you?
Right.
Or do you
Abs-
just need to vent right now, or do you want feedback? And
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times that she does ask for my feedback,
Oh, lovely.
which is really amazing at this point. There was a time when she was a teenager and we were in the throes of family therapy that she
Mhm.
didn't. And it's because my energy was so different. I came
Yeah.
in with that energy of having to fix. And
Right.
you're so right, because when I step in and I knew it, but I still couldn't do it. Then when I step in and say, let me tell you how you can fix this, telling them that they're not capable of
Absolutely. Right.
doing it. I'm
Yeah.
clipping their wings.
Yes, that's where we start robbing them of their own self-esteem. Like every time, and this can happen in small ways. I want to do the thing for my kid. I want to open the bag for them when they're struggling to open the bag. But literally every time we do something like that, we're sending them a message. You can't do this. I need to do it for you. It does rob them of their self-esteem. And that's not what we want for our kids. We want our kids to feel like, I got this. I could do it. The more encouragement we can give towards that, I know you're going through a tough time and I know you got this, right? That helps reinforce to them, like, I can do this and I'm here. And they know that they can reach out for support. In my own codependency, I can be very extreme where I just will do everything myself. I'm not asking for help. I'll just figure it all out. And then maybe at some point I'll let one person into this thing. But when we help our kids figure out how to let support in and when not to use it, that is helping them find a beautiful balance where they're not being hyper independent. Like, I have to do everything myself because nobody's going to help me. And they're not overly dependent where they're like, I can't do anything. I do need my mom to figure this out. We're helping cultivate this in between place that helps them know support is necessary at times, but it's not necessary all the time. So when do I need it and when can I pull back?
That is beautiful. I love that. And I have one of each. My son is hyper independent and my daughter can be hyper dependent. Now, both are learning to balance that out
Right.
because they just are. So that's beautiful. Honestly, I feel like I could talk to you about this for another 2 hours. I love this topic, and we are just hitting the tip of the iceberg on talking about codependency in light of keeping the time mindful for the listeners. We'll wrap it up here, but maybe we can have a part two at some point. I would love to talk more about the parenting piece and help because a majority of the listeners are parents, moms who listen. So maybe we can do a part two and go a little bit deeper in terms of showing them some ways they can start to tackle this. Just to leave them with something today. Do you have one suggestion for them?
That's tough. I will
I
say
know.
say 2 things. One,
Okay.
like, just start to observe. That's the most important part so that you can bring awareness to how this is showing up in your life, where you see yourself jumping into things when perhaps you don't need to, no one asked you to, that kind of stuff. I've been working with a mother of children who are similar to your kids' ages for a couple of years. I just did a joint session with them a few weeks ago. I hadn't met the older daughter up until this point, or one of the daughters till this point. And she turned to her mom and said to her, and this mom's been working so hard on taking a step back, changing her energy, changing her thought patterns around what her children need, their ability to move through things, all of this stuff that we're talking about. It was so lovely. The daughter turned to her and said, I feel the difference in you, and it makes me feel safer to talk to you about things and be with you. And that to me is what it's all about. We don't always need to include the other person at all in our work. She had been doing years of work on herself, and her daughter noticed it, felt the difference, and their relationship started to change as a result of it. So, anyone who's listening, I just want you to be thinking you just need to start with yourself in small ways, and they will keep building upon each other if you have the right support and you're reflecting in these ways that are conscious. Eventually, people will feel the difference from you. You don't have to tell everyone about it, they just feel it and it starts to shift things.
I concur because
Mhm.
I've done it and I am there. And we can, the work we do on ourselves can have a ripple effect on
Absolutely.
all of our relationships. Where can the listeners find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at the Codependent Perfectionist. It's also my website, thecodependentperfectionist.com. I also have quizzes there on codependency and perfectionism. If you want to learn more, you can find my book and I have a card deck as well, all on my website.
Thank you so much. Such a valuable, insightful, full of wisdom episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Kim.
There you have it. That was a jam-packed episode of information, wisdom, description of codependency traits, perfectionistic traits, what it looks like to be enmeshed, and what you can do about it. I absolutely loved this conversation with Alana. We were just touching the tip of the iceberg on codependency and perfectionism. Hopefully, we'll be able to do a follow up episode where we can dive a little bit deeper. If you loved this conversation as much as I did, feel free to leave a review. You can even subscribe on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. And if you have comments, if you have questions for me or for Alana, feel free to leave a comment or even email me. You can go to my website, Kim Gross Coaching. You can take my perfectionist quiz there, People Pleaser quiz. And I have a slew of information on what are some of the traits or characteristics of perfectionists and people pleaser. There's also a
place where you can click a button to schedule a discovery call. If you're like, I already know that I have these tendencies and I really want to unhook from these patterns. I want to take off this perfection mask. I want to recover from codependency. Then by all means, feel free to schedule a call with me. It's a 30-minute call. It's free. We can just chat and you can decide if working with me for coaching is something that would be valuable to you.